Hello, everybody. It's Friday, January the 2nd, 2026. Happy New Year, everyone. New year, old subject. A couple of years ago, we did a show with Siddhartha Kara, one of the world's most adventurous and perhaps brave journalists, wrote a book called Cobalt Red, How the Blood of the Congo Powers Our Lives. An important book, an important subject. Last year, we did another interview with Sam George from the Bertelsmann Foundation, who's made a documentary film about a similar subject. It's called Lithium Rising, the race for critical minerals. These minerals are powering our cell phones and all our other digital devices. And we're back to a similar theme for our conversation today with Nicolas Niarchos, another international journalist. He has a new book out, The Elements of Power, a story of war, technology, and the dirtiest supply chain on Earth. Nick Niarchos is joining us from Switzerland. Nick, congratulations on the new book. It's out on the 20th of January. What are you saying that hasn't been said in the Siddhartha Kara book? There have been a number of other books on this subject. I know you even wrote an interesting review of Cobalt Red for the New York Review of Books.
Yeah, I mean, I think Siddhartha Kara's book is first, thanks very much for the kind congratulations and Happy New Year. I think Siddhartha Kara's book was a key sort of moment of raising awareness of this. There were sort of there's been sort of various points along the way. In 2016, there was a report called "This Is What We Die For" by Amnesty International, which was actually the sort of first big report on this, and there'd been sort of articles in the Associated Press and Bloomberg beforehand. But his book really looked at the artisanal supply chain of cobalt. And my book, I guess, is a bit more broad. You know, I look at Western Sahara, where phosphate, a lot of phosphate comes from. I look at the lithium mining industry in Congo as it is, sort of untapped resources. I look at nickel mining in Indonesia, and I also look at the sort of Chinese context about critical mineral domination by the Chinese. So I think that's sort of what distinguishes these books. His book is very, very focused on artisanal mining, which is a very specific issue in the DRC, and my book sort of broadens the scope. It also looks at industrial mining, and which is in 2024 it was 98% of mining out of the DRC. So his book had important conclusions about one segment of the industry, and I guess I've sort of broadened the lens basically.
Your book comes with a nice blurb from the CNN broadcaster Clarissa Ward. She was on the show a few years ago. She wrote a book about her experience in Syria. She argues that you unpack what she calls the dirty paradox of clean energy. What is this dirty paradox, Nick?
I think we have this idea that digital power, digital energy, and digital devices sort of drop like sort of manna from the heavens, and we have our cell phone, we look at it, we don't really think about where it comes from. And I think very similarly, we think, okay, well, we've got a Tesla car, we've got a BYD if you live in Europe or in China, and this is a clean form of energy. This is something that's really an oil-free car, what in the 1970s they used to call a smokeless car. And it doesn't cause pollution, but at the same time, when you start unpacking it, when you start looking at this, at what Clarissa very kindly called what Clarissa very astutely called a paradox, you realize that actually these things come from sources that are very unclean. And in fact, I run the numbers several times throughout writing this book, and I realized that when you look at it, the cleanest type of car to have is not an electric vehicle. The cleanest type of car to have is a hybrid vehicle, and that's just because the batteries are so fossil fuel intensive to produce. So just on a purely pollution level, it's not necessarily correct to say that electric vehicles are clean energy. And then when you look at it from the human rights angle, which Siddharth Kara looks at, extensively in his book, then you realize that it's really quite remarkably problematic. I will say that Tesla, for what it's worth, more to do with price reasons, buys from industrial mines, but those, of course, have issues relating to China's control of the supply chain as well. So, child labor is probably not contributing to your Tesla battery, but there are a whole host of other issues that are there.
Another headline today is that Tesla car sales dropped 9% in 2025, partially, I think, because of Elon Musk's general political unpopularity in the West, falling behind China's BYD. In the book, as you noted earlier, is there a fundamental difference between Tesla cars and BYD cars? Are they all, to requote Clarissa Ward, do they all reflect this dirty paradox of clean energy?
I mean, I think they all definitely do, and I think BYD, comes with a sort of different set of regulations, and I would say a much more relaxed set of regulations because it's in China, and as we know, there's a lot of energy from the Chinese Communist Party to promote Chinese electric vehicles. So I think they're let off in many ways, and also China in general is more comfortable with polluting industries than Europe or perhaps some states in the US. And so I think that the thing that undergirds, I would say, the second half of the book is this remarkable rise of companies like BYD and CATL, which are these Chinese companies that were really, I mean, they were these tiny little workshops, 25, 30 years ago. I mean, they were these little shops in Shenzhen and in other towns in China have grown to become these behemoths, often with a great deal of aid from the Chinese government, very low interest loans, and a great deal of state support. So it's not like they've done it completely by themselves, but they've worked very, very hard to do it. And you do see Wang Chanfu, who's the chairman of BYD, and Robin Zhang. I mean, they're these sort of almost like monk-like ascetic figures who dedicate themselves to their work, and their whole thing is about beating the rest of the world when it comes to battery production, electric vehicle production, and sort of making China number one. So I think that's really the kind of message of those sections of the second half of the book.
Sounds a little bit like Max Weber's argument in The Protestant Ethic and the Origins of Capitalism, which he looked at 19th century European capitalism. Are you suggesting then that there's a kind of Puritanism driving Chinese new energy capitalism, which maybe is lacking in the West? You don't find a lot of Puritanism, I think, with guys like Elon Musk, certainly, or Jeff Bezos.
Well, I think that Musk definitely employs that sort of puritanical ideal and at least in his self-presentation of how he built Tesla and how he kind of lived on the work floor and slept underneath his desk and that kind of thing. But I think you're right. I mean, I think that as Weber and other people point out, that there is this sort of undergirding focus on work as the redeeming virtue of sort of early stage capitalism, I guess. And one could argue that as we've moved into a sort of late capitalist period, and I don't want to be somebody who says, "Oh, well, it's all in the Roman Empire," but you do get to a point where you're saying, okay, look, there are some people who are working much harder in order to produce the things that we use every day in life, and they're not coming from the US. That's for sure.
You are, as I said, a journalist. You've spent a lot of time for this book in the Democratic Republic of Congo and many other places. The standard narrative is, you know, much better than I do about the Chinese in Africa. Is they're the new colonialists. If Conrad was around today, he would write A New Heart of Darkness and Apocalypse Now, reflecting Chinese colonialization. Are the Chinese, and this touches on your point before in this relationship between the Chinese state and Chinese entrepreneurs, are they more or less heartless than the West, or are they all in the same business of trying to extract these rare minerals from Africa, and they'll do it in any way they can?
Yeah, I mean, I think that to compare how China is acting in Congo today to what King Leopold did, after 1885 in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, then the Congo Free State. I mean, it's uncomparable. I mean, the Belgians back in the day killed up to 10 million people, or around 10 million people, and that's in that wonderful and very, very disturbing book, King Leopold's Ghost, the journalist Adam Hochschild.
Yeah, and Adam's an old friend. He's been on the show many times. So yeah, absolutely.
I mean, he unpacks that in a really, powerful way. And I would say that yes, there are aspects of what China is doing that are colonialist, but they're much more mercantile. I mean, there's an aspect of colonialism that is mercantile, and then there's an aspect of colonialism that is about controlling and dominating and so on. I think the Chinese are much less interested in the controlling and dominating part. They're actually quite happy to let authoritarian regimes do whatever they want. They're not particularly ideological with their aid. They used to be in the 60s. There's a small section of the book in which I talk about Chinese aid to rebel groups in the DRC during the, or it was then, yeah, I guess it was then the DRC as well, because as we know, the Congo has gone through various different name changes throughout the years, but the Chinese at that point were acting more in a sort of typical colonialist way, and I think that since the early 2000s, since the China goes out policy, they have behaved more in a way that I guess it's a sort of almost ethics-free mercantilist way, and it's very capitalist, and with the look at China, and you think of China as this sort of, to some extent, socialist country. I mean, the socialist ideals sort of go out the window when they're operating in Africa.
Donald Trump, the American president, is also interested in this business. He recently unveiled a US Saudi venture on rare earth minerals. How different is US policy and indeed Gulf policy in Africa when it comes to the extraction of these minerals?
Well, I think Gulf policy, to answer the second part of your question first, Gulf policy is nascent on critical minerals, and I think it's driven by fears around the move away from oil and kind of very long-term strategic thinking. And the UAE is kind of at the forefront, and they've done several deals in Congo. Quite a lot of them actually have to do with gold, but they have been involved in some sort of various critical mineral projects in the east of the country, especially. So I would say that they're starting to think about this as an issue. They have hosted the president of the DRC, Abu Dhabi, several times, and Dubai, and I think they're trying to figure out where they can add value to that supply chain. I think that the US is in a very different situation. I think the US both has deposits of critical minerals and has deposits of rare earths, for example, but doesn't necessarily want to refine them on US soil because it's a very polluting enterprise. So I think they're trying to figure out how to move that supply chain away from China and how to be involved in deals, but they haven't figured out the midstream, which is the processing of these minerals. China controls up to 90% of the midstream refining for these minerals, and I think that allows them to cut off, you know, we saw in the last year with these two rare earths bans that China has enforced in April and in October, and China has basically allowed itself to has basically shown its dominance with regards to critical metals, and I think that's why Trump is definitely worried about it, and of course in the last month, I think it was in early December, 4th of December, he signed a strategic partnership with the DRC, and at the moment we have two letters of interest that have been announced, and then there's also a third company that's interested in critical metals in a town called Monono, and that's a sort of the third company, which is a US company. So I think that's essentially where the US is heading, to more of the kind of mining and extraction of these metals. But the question is, do US companies actually want to get involved in this? And the overwhelming evidence at the moment is that there are very few US companies or very few large US companies that want to be involved in this. The last big US mining company to be involved in the DRC, actually the last US company really full stop to be involved in the DRC, apart from a Coca-Cola bottling plant in the Kasai, was Freeport-McMoRan, which had the giant China Moly mine at Tenke-Fungurume. And that mine was completely, that mine today is the largest cobalt mine in the world, very, very critical. And, nothing could induce Freeport to hold on to it. And that was a combination both of them being worried about being prosecuted under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and also just because doing business in Congo is really, really difficult, and I think that a lot of US companies have moved away from wanting to do that, and Chinese companies are just much more comfortable in that environment.
Isn't it the consequences, though, rather than the direct implications of doing business in Congo, the way in which these products are being used? I mean, Elon Musk is probably not the most sophisticated moral thinker, but there are people in the US like Tim Cook, who runs Apple, who seem to be credibly moral, who care about human rights. If Tim Cook was to read your book, The Elements of Power, what would you like him to take away from it?
Well, I think that Tim Cook has made, he's...
And just to be clear here, of course, Cook runs Apple, who I assume, Nick, you might know much more about this than me, is what the biggest buyer of lithium-ion batteries, or certainly amongst the biggest buyers.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Apple is moving towards recycling of these metals. I think that what I'd like him to take away from this is actually, rather than cutting cobalt out of the supply chain entirely, rather than moving to fully recycled metals, although that's a very, very worthy aim, you will need to have some fresh supply into your supply chain at some point, and you probably will need it continuously over the next couple of years, especially if they plan to keep on scaling up production of iPhones and Macs and so on. And what I would say is that I would hope that he understands that interacting with and dealing with local communities on a sort of very on the ground level, which is very possible, because you do see some communities in the DRC that are able to use their they're called redevance minière. It's the royalties that you get from mining. It's the money that you get back as a community. They're able to take that money and they're not using it in a corrupt way, and they're able to build up farming and capacity and infrastructure and education in their communities, and they're actually to some extent thriving, although the general politics of that country continuously drags them down. I would say sort of working with local communities is the most important thing, and sort of listening to Congolese people, listening to people in the Western Sahara, if you're going to use lithium iron phosphate batteries, and sort of prioritizing human rights at the center of your supply chain, clean mining techniques, because it can be done, and there are many mines that do use closed cycle um, mines, use closed cycle techniques, and also sort of not working with corrupt officials. I think sort of working with companies that are not engaged in this kind of nefarious activity. And unfortunately, Apple until last year had a company called Congo. Well, it actually had a company, the parent company of this Congo Dongfang Mining, which is called Huayu Cobalt, which is a huge cobalt miner and refiner in China. They had that in their supply chain, listed in their supply chain, listed in their sort of clean supply chain, clean sort of transparent supply chain. And you look at that company and you just think, how, I mean, you go to the depots of CDM, as it's called in the DRC, and you say, how can this company be listed as a clean miner and refiner? Because it's people lugging sacks of ore that have come from God knows where. I mean, you could spend 2 days in the DRC and figure that out.
Do you think, reminds me of that famous scene in Casablanca, do you think that Apple knows everything that's happening, or companies like Apple, powerful Western companies like Apple, multi-trillion dollar companies know what's happening, and they throw this over the wall to their PR or marketing departments to make the most of it morally, and basically ignore what they know because it might undermine their profits?
Yeah, they certainly should know, because I mean, again, I went to the DRC as a sort of freelance journalist writing for magazines, basically, and figured it out. So these companies with trillion-dollar revenues and things like that, or not revenue, trillion-dollar valuations. I mean, surely they could have people understanding. So it's either that or a willful ignorance, basically.
You've written very powerfully about what's happening in the Sudan, in Congo. You wrote moving piece recently for the New Yorker, Escape from Khartoum. You dedicate your book, Nick, to the people of Congo who you say deserve better. What would that mean? What would deserving better mean?
Yeah, what does better look like for a country that has basically been at war since 1997? Is the largest conflict, or sorry, the most deadly conflict since the Second World War. Millions of people dying of completely treatable diseases. I mean, it's pretty depressing. I mean, Sudan, obviously, the conflict there is different, because there are sort of direct U.S. allies basically supplying weapons to a genocidal militia. But putting that to one side, the people of Congo, people of Congo deserve the opportunity to develop their country, and to preserve their country as well, to preserve their environment, because a lot of the discourse, or a lot of the kind of the traditions in that country are around, especially in the southern mining region, around trees and nature, and living with nature, and that's sort of being erased by this kind of completely one-track extractive mindset on one side, and then on the other side you have this kind of horrendous war and corruption that is coming from basically externally to the south of Congo. So it's becoming this. It's unfortunately it's sort of becoming a country, and it has become this country in which it's almost impossible to live a life in which you want better things for your children, and you want development, and you want instead we have this country in which everybody's just sort of barely trying to survive, and they have and they're kind of the only way to operate is this sort of very corrupt way, and it's really upsetting because culturally, musically, just in terms of storytelling, in terms of real sort of ingenuity, like almost you meet some of the most intelligent people that you ever met, sort of operating in incredibly dire circumstances, and just allowing them to have the opportunity to do something with that would be better, I suppose.
You wrote an interesting piece for Truth Out back in February of last year. It was entitled "Civilians in Congo Suffer as Elites at Home and Abroad Jockey for Profits." Some, I wouldn't say apologists for the West, but some corporate people might say, well, the problem is in Congo with political leaders. It's not our fault. Is the book more of a critique of the political corruption or the political dysfunctionality of Congo, or about Western involvement, Western corporate involvement, companies like Apple in Congo?
Yeah, I mean, I think the book is both. To be honest, I think that Congolese political corruption is a very, very important issue, and I do not think it's entirely caused by the West. I think that there are trends that exacerbate this, and when you see the president of DRC going to the south of France for 2 months on his mega yacht and partying
Who is the president? Who's the current president, Nick?
Félix Antoine Tshisekedi Chilombo. When you see him again going and throwing these huge parties in Dubai, I mean, I think you have a situation in which you realize that a guy who essentially was a mid-ranking politician, albeit one with a strong family connection to a popular opposition leader, suddenly rocking up with a new golden Patek Philippe watch every day of the week. You have to understand, and being president of one of the poorest countries in the world, you do kind of realize that something's going on there. So I don't think I'm in any way uncritical of what's happening in the DRC. That piece for Truth Out was more focused on the war in the East, which is an area which is rich in gold, tantalum, tungsten, and tin, which are all important metals for electronics as well. And that war is very much supported by external actors. Rwanda is involved. Uganda, to some extent, is involved. Burundi is now sending troops to the DRC, and then there are sort of a level removed. There are the people who support those countries, and there's French influence in Rwanda. The DRC has gone to various people to look for mercenaries. China is selling weapons to both. I mean, so I think that there's definitely a very, very complicated and layered conflict that is happening there. But that's actually quite apart from what we were talking about in the south. The south of Congo is much more of a pure resource play for the politicians in Kinshasa. And if you want to blame anybody internally, it is elites in Kinshasa that are profiting and not sending the money back to the provinces. And I think that actually real corporate engagement might look like Apple going to Congo and saying, look, we want to buy X amount of cobalt, and saying, but look, we want to see that the money is going back to development projects within the region of Okatanga or Lualaba and whatever, and that it's not just sitting in politicians' pockets. But that kind of, then it becomes a sovereignty issue, and say, look, you're stepping on our toes. So I see why it's difficult for them to do that. I can't imagine that it's impossible, though.
I'm not suggesting, Nick, that you are equivalent in moral terms to a corrupt Congolese politician, but you yourself are from a remarkably distinguished family. You just had a very high-profile marriage to Italian aristocrat. You're connected both to a very prominent Greek shipping company and the Guinnesses of Ireland. Are you in any way aware of, shall we say, the moral ambiguity or complications of such a privileged fellow going to Congo, writing this book? I'm not suggesting it's not for real, and then being able to come back to Europe and holiday in Scotland or Italy or the Hamptons.
Yeah, well, I think there was a lot of misreporting about my wedding by the Greek press, but
typical Greek press, right? But I assume it was a nice wedding, Nick.
A lovely wedding, yeah. It was wonderful, and I think that I think that your question sort of touches on two things for me. The first of which is that this story, to me, is not a story specifically about just about the DRC. It's about our global responsibility to do something about this. And of course, capitalism in general is this kind of like is a global system, and I think that we have to focus on how we can improve it ourselves within our own world. The second thing that I'd like to say is that, I guess you're not really, in many ways, you're defined by what people think about you from your background or your upbringing and so on. But you have to make your own future, basically, and I think that you have to look at the world, and you have to look at the world critically. And were I to be living in the 1950s and be looking at the shipping industry, I don't think I would have made some of the same decisions as my relatives or your made. But this is now, and this is my opportunity to do something which makes sense to some extent.
And you certainly have. But I assume sometimes when you're walking around seeing all this human suffering, it might have occurred to you, I might be better off, rather than writing a book, or maybe in addition to writing a book, calling up my relatives, borrowing the address book of your parents, and simply using your network to bring in resources. The American government in particular, given what's happening in Washington, D.C. with Donald Trump, I'm guessing is probably not going to be particularly receptive to some of the arguments in your book. Is there an opportunity for powerful Westerners with a conscience to get involved and begin to fund or defund initiatives which are causing so much human suffering?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I've thought about this quite a lot, and I think that this idea that like any one person can have an overarching effect on the supply chain, or sorry, can have this kind of like earth-shattering effect on the supply chain, I think it's a little bit misguided, and I think that that's to some extent why you haven't seen more activism around this, because it's such a complicated and such a sort of spider web like series of transactions and interactions between different people. So I think it's very easy to look at it and despair. And I think that, I guess, in many ways, when I started this book, Siddharth Kara hadn't written his book, and forgive me, Henry Sanderson also wrote a book called Bolt Rush, which is focused on various different critical metals mining companies, and those books didn't exist. And I think that my first thought was really like, what would what would it look like in 1910 or so, had there been a really good guide to how the oil industry works and how the um, how the sort of global supply chain around oil works, and perhaps people could use that and then take that knowledge and try to improve things. So I think that perhaps is my misguidedly perhaps optimistic way of the way that the hopefully the book will be used.
You begin the book with a quote from a Greek philosopher, Kostas Axelros, from a book called The Game, who's best known for his book, The Game of the World. He's a mix, apparently I hadn't heard of him, he sounds very interesting, of Nietzsche and Marx and German philosophers. And I'm quoting Nick, it begins, within the techno-scientific setup that seizes the world, there is no longer the sovereign good, not even the happiness of humanity, its well-being and comfort. Humans have and will have to live and die without comprehending what is happening, why it is happening, and how it is happening. That's a rather pessimistic opening to a book, and it contrasts with some more positive environmentalists. Bill McKibben was on the show recently. He has a new book out, Here Comes the Sun, suggesting there's an opportunity to save the world, maybe not Congo. Is this an optimistic or a pessimistic book? And tell me a little bit more about Axelos. Why did you choose to begin with a quote from him?
Well, of course I had to begin with a quote from a Greek because
that goes without saying. You grew up in Greece, but there are other Greeks you could have started with, not just Axelos.
Yeah, no, I think that book I read during my reporting process, and it sort of stuck with me that moment in the book. I mean, it's a series of almost epigrams, basically, and it kind of gives this it's this highly complicated and sort of playful philosophy, which I think doesn't have the kind of necessarily the arrogance of a Heidegger, or to some extent a Marx as well. Doesn't have this kind of, it has this kind of this ludic quality, which I'm very which I found sort of refreshing in a way. And I found that sort of quote, that moment, was for me it was funny because it sort of goes back to what I was speaking about. It was sort of like, the idea is that this book can give you just a moment of clarity, and as a kind of, as a way of trying to understand the world when it has been so obscured, when it has been so cloaked by what he calls the techno-scientific setup.
You could have started with Varoufakis. He's, again, another old friend of the show. Finally, Nick, fascinating conversation. You've been very generous with your time, and I appreciate you answering some of my more obnoxious questions very honestly.
Go ahead.
What should people do? I mean, we're doing this over the internet. Mm-hmm. We all have iPhones. We all have EVs. We're all, in one way or the other, we all want to believe, at least in McKibben's argument about the sun and batteries and all the rest of it. What should and shouldn't we be doing? A lot of people will be saying, well, I kind of agree with him, but what can I do? I can't choose whether or not I have no idea what kind of batteries, what sufferings behind the batteries in my iPhone or in my EV. What should realistically people do? They can't all do what you did and bravely go to Congo and report on this.
Well, I don't think everybody needs to go to Congo and report.
Well, they can read your book, right?
Well, they can read the book. But I think that beyond reading the book, and look, I think that what Bill says is right. And he was somebody who I fact checked several times at the New Yorker, and always really enjoyed working for. and he was, his optimism springs from the remarkable technological progress that we've made, and I think this is the point of the book as well, is that doing this in a clean way and using lithium-ion batteries to deal with climate change is actually there is an opportunity. We have this amazing opportunity, but the fact is that it's not being done well at the moment. I think that again, it's insisting on clean mining, insisting on human rights, insisting on a lack of or insisting on anti-corruption. I think that these things need to be core elements to core parts of a clean energy, a battery strategy. So I think that's I guess sort of getting involved and writing to companies and things like that. And if you want to take a slightly less activist position, you can cut down on your consumption of cobalt batteries, or work with companies that there's going to be this new European battery passport. I think it's out next year, which talks about how clean the sources that how clean the sources of minerals that went into the batteries are, and all those things are very much at the center of sort of behaving responsibly toward this. I mean, I guess it's the equivalent of saying, oh, and sorry, forgive me. One other thing: for electric cars, don't buy a new electric car every 3 years, which is what many people do, because it sort of amortizes over time, and you do actually get if you have an electric car for 15 years, you will get to a point where it is being cleaner than having a gas vehicle.
But coming back, and final question, Nick, coming back to where we began, the China versus America on the moral front, you seem to be saying that you trust the Chinese as much as the Americans, in some ways, perhaps even more than the Americans, to actually do the right thing in Africa.
No, I don't think I trust the Chinese to do the right thing. I think that they're amoral. I think the history of the US and Africa has been immoral in many ways. The assassination of Patrice Lumumba, and they did various different things, but and they supported all kinds of terrible apartheid type regimes in South Africa.
And they still seem to be doing that in South Africa.
Exactly, and it's so I don't think that the US has this kind of bright moral compass that everybody seems to suggest that it once had, or something like that. But I think that everybody around the world needs in power needs to understand more about this issue, and really has to, optimistically, I would say, good governance on this issue would be to come back to the drawing table and say, or to the drawing board, forgive me, it's getting late here, and say, look, this is how the system works, and this is going to become, this is how we can improve it. And I think that neither China nor the US has shown particular excitement, or it's basically become this kind of new Cold War in Africa. So I don't think, the first time round between the Soviets and the US, I don't think anybody really benefited from that, apart from people who were pocketing aid money. And I think these days, I think the same thing is happening. It's tearing places to pieces.
There you have it. Amorality versus immorality. The Elements of Power by Nicolas Niarchos. A very, very important new book about a really, really important subject. Nick, congratulations on the book. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
Best of luck.
Thanks a lot.